And as Judy mentioned, I'm going to be talking about talking about what we've learned working in the with the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. I'm going to um, structure my remarks, especially the second half of the remarks, around the question of will the election of 2020 be safe, which was not always, we didn't always know the answer back in March when we started our work, but I will give you the quick answer, which is yes. Now, I will still talk to you. I will. There's more to the talk than this, but here's the answer. And actually, I'm fairly sanguine, given despite all of the challenges, and keeping in mind there still are some challenges to come. I think we are on a glide path to have a much safer, equitable, accessible election than many of us had worried about back in March when COVID started to overtake the country, right as we were also beginning the primary election season. So my remarks this morning will be divided in two. And first of all, I will be doing a little bit of shameless shilling on behalf of the Healthy Elections Project, just to let y'all know what we've been doing with the project, a little bit of its background, and to give you a little very quick tour about what you can find on our website, and then jump to a talk about the evidence, or we're seeing, what we've seen over the last 7 months and what we're seeing right now with respect to the election. So let me first of all just talk about the Healthy Elections Project. The Healthy Elections Project started back in March when COVID began to overtake the country. My friend and colleague, Nate Persily, is a law professor at Stanford University. He's also a political scientist. Nate and I started working we've known each other for many, many years. We started working together in 2013 when Nate was the research director of President Obama's on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. And he worked, well, he asked me and the Voting Technology Project, which I lead, to put together a group of experts to advise the commission. And as a consequence of that activity, Nate and I got a lot of practice in working with election officials, and in particular working between election officials and experts to help bring best practices to the administration of elections. Back in March, when the pandemic began to roll across elections, there was also beginning to be a rising crescendo of litigation and lawsuits against states and localities to try to expand the franchise, to loosen things up, to make it as easy as possible to vote under the circumstances in the emergency. And we were cognizant of those lawsuits, and aware of a couple of things. First of all, we imagined that there would be a lot of changes to the logistics of elections, and many of these lawsuits to expand access to mail balloting, et cetera, would be successful. Nonetheless, you can't sue yourself solely to an accessible election. The tremendous pivots that election officials were taking were ultimately logistical ones. And without proper logistical preparation, without access to the best practices, we could have all sorts of court rulings and legislative pronouncements saying that we would basically pivot in a number of ways with election administration. But if things weren't carried out properly, then there could be a real mess and an existential threat to the election. And so that was the genius behind the project. It's since expanded to include not only the universities of MIT and Stanford. And by the way, I should say we have teams at Stanford and MIT of students, mostly graduate and law students, who've been writing reports and working in this area. And I'll say a little bit about that in just a second. We also have a number of partners at other universities, such as Gretchen Mock at University of Rhode Island, who's a industrial engineer. Mindy Romero at the University of Southern California, who's a sociologist, who have developed tools to help in the management of in-person voting during COVID. We've partnered with a large collaborative of former election officials led by Jen Morrell, who used to run elections in Colorado, in a county in Colorado, a lot of experience with mail balloting. Her group that we've been able to support both logistically and through donations that we've been able to help channel her way, have embedded with election officials around the country who had very little experience with voting by mail to help them manage the transition. And so we've been able to, both through our own research, which is kind of traditional university research, we've been through that research been able to serve as a way station between officials and expertise. There's a lot of information here about the logistics of managing mail elections, redesigning polling places, et cetera. There's a lot of information here about for the public and for the press about what's going on. But we've also kind of behind the scenes been able to support either financially or through creating connections among a large group of civic tech people, nonprofits, and some former election officials to help work with the many local officials around the country. If you go to healthyelections.org, which you can, I don't encourage you to do it now, this morning, but after today's lunch, go to healthyelections.org and check out the website. There's a lot of information there. It starts with the research done by our students about what's happened in the states. We first started by writing postmortems of the various primaries as they happened, and then we've gone through to really assess both in terms of just qualitatively what's happened with election administration, but also quantitatively with what's happened with absentee ballots, voter registration, other important logistical aspects of the election. We have a lot of material about voting by mail, some of it developed by our students, much of it in reference to links to other organizations around the country that have worked on providing resources and information about voting by mail. Working with the Stanford Design School, we've helped to support the development of written materials, videos that are available to election officials and to the public that touch on issues of redesign, of mask wearing, of everything involved with voting under these weird circumstances, information about becoming a poll worker. In addition to the information and the links related to becoming a poll worker, we've worked actively with groups such as Power the Polls and other groups that have recruited poll workers. As a point of reference, about 1 million people volunteer to register, to serve as poll workers on election day. We've been able to work with partners to recruit somewhere around so far about 600,000 people who have volunteered to help fill those positions. And so I'll talk a bit more about that later on. There are online tools that are available. You can take a look. I won't dwell on those that touch on various aspects of election administration. Reports about, some access to data around voting by mail, data visualizations, many reports on certain topics. We have over 500 pages of original research about various aspects of the election, voting by mail, in-person polling places. Here you can see the most recent report that was posted up a couple of days ago about voter facing vote tracking, what's happening in the various states, so you can track your absentee ballot. Right before that, we had a report about ballot drop boxes and ballot harvesting laws around the country. So there's just a lot of information. For those of you who are interested in such things, we have a litigation tracker. There's nearly 400 court cases right now related to voting, specifically related to COVID. There's other cases as well, but there's 400 around the country, and we're tracking that as well. So there's a lot of information on that website, and I encourage you to go take a look. And I encourage you to take a look. I encourage election officials, if they're still looking for information, to go there as well. So let me turn to some substantive remarks about whether this is going to be a safe election. And recently my mind has been drawn back to March when we began this project, and I was out in California during the their Super Tuesday primary, and I think we can remember the good old days when elections looked like this. This is Los Angeles County, the first time that in a very large election they had used a new balloting system that I had helped been on a technical advisory committee for, people socially non-distanced, kind of carefree voting however they wanted to. Within 2 weeks, though, we were in a very different world. And reminds us in Ohio, for instance, where the governor pulled the plug the night before, in fact, hours before the polls were to be open, over concerns about voting, and the public health concerns particularly. And at that point, we recognized that there was going to be an existential threat to this election. There was there were there were questions at the time whether the election in November, in fact, could be postponed. At the time, I pointed out that because of constitutional and other constraints, even if it was zombies were walking the earth and asteroids were raining down on us, we would be having an election on November 3rd. And therefore, there was a major design constraint that we had to make sure that we could vote on November 3rd. We didn't have any choice. Nonetheless, things were kind of dicey during March and April, and we'll recall in Milwaukee, or rather in Wisconsin, where they went ahead with their election, despite the challenges they saw there. And I'll come back to Milwaukee in just a second, but at the time, things didn't look very good. More recently, though, for those of us who voted in primaries in the later part of the summer, and people around the country that have begun to vote in person and by mail, it's been a very different world. Here's a picture of my home precinct around the corner from where I live. It's also, by the way, where Elizabeth Warren votes, and you will see something that kind of looks like normal. If you were to look a little closer, you would see that some of the booths were marked off so that we could be distanced from each other when we voted in person, and people were wearing shields and masks, and outside there was 6 foot of distance between people in line. So, and this is what we're seeing around the country. Local officials have figured out what to do. Of course, voting by mail has been expanded. Importantly, drop boxes have become common in most of the country. There's some exceptions, but we can see here the picture from the Boston City Hall of drop box during the primary. There's getting to be what I've called arena voting in many places around the country. This is the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, where they've set up early voting, and they've already had tens of thousands of people go through this facility, guaranteeing social distancing during in-person voting. So the world has changed, and I'll come back to this, but it is a really different world from the one that we were worried about back in March. But as one, quite frankly, that I was convinced that we could overcome those challenges. Now, at the time, the imperative was to de-densify in-person polling places. And there are 2 ways to achieve that imperative: by moving people away from in-person voting, by which I mean we had to move more people to vote by mail, and that we had to decrease the capacity of in-person polling places while maintaining as many polling places as possible. And this has been one of the challenges that's been the hardest to communicate and achieve, but it's been really, really important. And that is to say, maintaining as many polling places as possible, indeed expanding the number of polling places, if at all possible, for early voting and for election day, for many reasons. There are some people who still need to vote in person because of language concerns, because of certain types of disabilities. There are many people, as we've discovered, need to vote in person because it's a fail-safe when the mail ballot doesn't show up and you have to vote in person. Many people distrust the mail, and they were distrusting the mail even before the kerfuffle over the summer about the USPS. There are late deciders and voters. For people on this call, sometimes it's hard to remember that there are people who don't think a whole lot about politics and will wake up a couple of days before the election and say, gee, I wonder what that's about. Or a little more charitably, who will wake up sometime next week or the following week, and it will be too late at that point to request a mail ballot and to return it. They will have to vote in person. And so we'll have to have in person. And then, as I mentioned before, because of social distancing, as you saw in State Farm Arena, because of social distancing, we're moving polling places apart from each other. Or rather, like voting booths, et cetera, apart from each other. And in the typical polling place, the capacity is going to be reduced by something like 78 to 80% of what it could normally handle because of having to move the booths, the machines apart from each other. And so that's why we, in fact, may need more people, more polling places, even though we will have many fewer people voting by mail. And indeed, as we look, and these are pictures from Atlanta and from Georgia and from Texas in the last few days, we're seeing high demand for in-person voting, in this case on early voting. But I'm convinced, and we talk about that, but I'm also convinced that we're going to see high demand for in-person voting on election day. Now, the challenge getting there has been a number of points of challenge. One of those is just the lack of experience nationwide with voting by mail. Here's a graph that shows the percentage of people who voted by mail, voted on election day, and voted early from 1996 up until 2016, actually 2018, but I'll focus on 2016. A couple of things I'll point out here. First of all, in 2016, 60% of Americans voted on election day. About 20% voted by mail, and about 20% voted in person early. If you run back time, you'll see around 2000, it was 90% voting on election day, and only 10% voting early one way or the other, either by mail or in person. So there's been a big change over time. Nonetheless, most people in 2016 still voted in person. Secondly, these changes have been gradual, with election officials gradually deciding to change to encourage more voting by mail, more voting in person before election day. This is what this graph is going to look like when I do it after the election. Massive disruption. And so that's going to be management disruptions and other disruptions in laws and in logistics that are going to have to be managed. And this is just really unprecedented. Not only, this is the national view. If we look at the state view, we can see that we can see the nature of the picture of the challenge in a different way. This graph is one of my favorite graphs. Is a bit nerdy, but I'm from MIT. Let me tell you what it is, what it's showing. This is a plot that shows the percentage of voters in every state who voted on election day, by mail, and early in person. If a state is at the very top, it means that everybody is voting on election day. In the lower left hand of the triangle, everybody is voting by mail. On the right, everybody is voting early. So in 1996, almost all the states are at the very, very tippy top. We see on the left, Washington and Oregon are beginning their vote by mail experiments. We see Tennessee and Texas are beginning their development of voting in person early, but mostly states are still traditionally voting on election day with a little bit of absentee balloting. Okay. In 2016, we see, I sometimes call this the snow globe graph, because these states start to drift downward. And we see that, now we have Washington and Oregon down at the bottom left here. They're all vote by mail. Colorado close behind. Arizona, Utah, California, Montana, primarily voting by mail. A number of states primarily voting early. Florida out here by itself doing it all. And then a number of states loosening up on election day voting by kind of going between early voting and mail voting. The important thing with respect to the last graph is that if we're going to get a lot of people to vote by mail, we have to get these states over here to move up the upper right-hand part of this triangle to move down to the lower left. This includes states like Massachusetts. And in fact, Massachusetts is kind of a typical state in this regard. Okay. And you understand, and we've seen the challenges in Massachusetts, although they've not been particularly as dramatic as in a number of other states. So lack of experience, lack of capacity. For many large jurisdictions, this does not relate to Massachusetts so much because our municipalities run elections. but in most of the country, counties run elections, which means that when you go to vote by mail, you're going to have massive mail operations. When you have a small fraction of ballots done by mail, you can handle this manually. When you have 50, 60, 70% of your ballots by mail, you need to automate. And you need to buy equipment like this mail handling equipment. This piece of equipment, City of Chicago has like 3 of them, costs what a fire truck costs. It's about $100,000 for one of these. So counties, large counties that had never had a lot of mail balloting before, were faced with buying hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars of equipment to handle the mail, or contracts with mail handling system companies to handle the mail. Okay, so those sorts of big logistical challenges. There are restrictive laws in place. New York was a really good example of this because of the restricted laws, the technicalities that they had with their voting by mail. We saw in their primary, New York reject 20% of their mail ballots. Now, that's not a good thing. But that's how a lot of states viewed mail ballots previously, things to be avoided if you could, and that needed to change. And so developing, and then on top of all of this, it wasn't just you had to buy things, but you also had to develop procedures and procurement in order to make things happen. This is just a visual aid to show early in the pandemic, we came up with a list of all the processes and procedures and staffing that you would need to work on in order to pivot from primarily in person to primarily by mail. A lot of stuff to work on in here, just procedurally. And then there was protecting polling places, and this had to do primarily or mainly with people and with places. People. The challenge here, as I mentioned earlier, we have 1 million poll workers on election day in a general election. In 2016, 2/3 of those were over the age of 60, 1/4 were over the age of 70. Prime target area for the pandemic. This was freaking people out, not surprisingly. And in Milwaukee, which was going to vote right as things were starting to look pretty bleak in Wisconsin, they were going to have a primary. The blue dots here show you the planned polling places in the city of Milwaukee for the primary. This is the map of where they actually opened. Planned, opened. Milwaukee had to close 95% of their polling places because their poll workers refused to report to duty. So we were worried for good reason back in March and April. Places, churches, firehouses, schools were reluctant to be used as polling places, and things, of course, we were worried about Purell, PPE, etc. at the time. How are we doing? Pretty well, surprisingly well, in fact. So here are a couple of graphs that have a lot of details to them. I'm not going to focus on the details, but use them as props to talk about a couple of points. First of all, during the primaries, despite the challenges facing Americans to vote, turnout in the primaries, especially in the Democratic primary, was on average as high in 2020 as it was in 2016. It was lower in the Republican primary, but I attribute that to the fact that the nomination for president was already a done deal. It wasn't a done deal for the Democrats. Interestingly enough, even after it became a done deal for the Democrats, they still continued to turn out to vote. There was a dip in turnout for Ohio and Wisconsin, where things were really kind of uncertain. But once primaries took back up in May and June, turnout was really high. We figured out how to vote by mail very quickly. What this graph shows is the blue dots shows the percentage of turnout in the primaries in 2016 in which the votes were cast by mail. The red dots are the percentage in 2020. These states just show you the states that voted in primaries before COVID hit. There were a couple of states like Michigan and California that have been expanding voting by mail. So we already knew that they were going to expand their vote by mail, but most states were pretty much where they had been in 2016. This is what this graph looks like when we add the states that voted after COVID hit. Voters figured out how to request ballots despite the barriers in many states, notary requirements, witness requirements, etc. So we figured out how to vote by mail. So when we look right now, we see that mail ballots are going out early, they're coming back quickly, and poll worker recruitment is going surprisingly well. As of this morning, 81 million people have either requested a ballot or 81 million mail ballots have been mailed to voters around the country. For scale, we're expecting a turnout of about 150 million in this election. So a majority of Americans have already gotten a mail ballot for this election. Not only that, but almost 25 million have either returned a ballot or voted early already. That's 1/6 of the number of voters we're already expecting already. And we're just over 2 weeks away out from the election. This is what's happening in North Carolina. Actually, I did this graph this morning, and it illustrates what we're seeing state by state by state. The blue line just shows the time trend of how many ballots, mail ballots, were requested in North Carolina in 2016, and you can see that and the x-axis is the number of weeks before the election. And the important thing is that you can see there's kind of a gradual crescendo moving into close to the election day, and it plateaus out and then falls off. Compare the red line, which is the number of requests in North Carolina. A couple of things. First of all, that big value at the very beginning is what had accumulated during the spring and the summer. Okay. Then a couple of weeks ago, when basically right after Labor Day, there was another surge of requests. Okay, big surge of requests in September and August for mail ballots in North Carolina. In contrast to what happened 4 years ago, where the surge occurred in October. Okay, so people were asking for their ballots months ahead of time. Their vote, as Michelle Obama said, vote early, and they're voting early. They're also returning their ballots early. And these dashed lines show the number of ballots returned in North Carolina each week ahead of the election. Okay, so this is one state, North Carolina, I use because they have the best data available, but as we're looking at other states, it's the very same patterns. People have requested their ballots and they're returning them early in ways they've never done before. Poll workers. Here's an example for Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a website which advertises the towns that need poll workers. A month ago, if you went to this website, you would scroll down. All the towns needed. Right now, this Ashburnham needs some people. Lawrence and Lowell need bilingual translators. That's where things are in Massachusetts. Pretty much set with concerns about people with multilingual needs. And this is what we're seeing nationwide. Increasingly, local governments are saying, we're now recruiting for 2021. So poll workers were not totally out of the woods, but there's been an amazing response, especially among young people, to vote, to work the polls. A couple of worries, and I will end here. A couple of worries that are still there. I mean, there's actually a number of worries. Everyone's worried about this election still, but here are some special ones given what I've just said. First of all, that partisanship is endangering people, and there I'm just referring to the fact that this issue of whether you vote by mail has become partisan, with Democrats more likely to vote by mail than Republicans. And we can see the effect of this on some opinion polling that I've been doing. Other people have found the same thing. I've been polling every 2 weeks in the battleground states, asking likely voters how they plan to cast their ballots. And then when I look at this, comparing Democrats and Republicans, we see that Democrats are 40 points more likely to vote by mail than Republicans. And as we actually look at ballot requests in places where we know people's partisanship, this is basically how it's coming out as we look at the requests. If we think it's the healthy thing to do to vote by mail for many people, there are a lot of people who are choosing an unhealthy path in this election. Furthermore, there is going to be crowding of in-person voting when there wouldn't have to be if more people were to vote by mail. So that is a concern of mine. But that's really largely a public health concern as much as an election administration concern. There are concerns about mail balloting. From the past, mail ballots have been rejected because people have waited too late to request and return, or because they haven't paid attention to the instructions, or actually more accurately, the instructions have been so obscure and the form so poorly designed that it wasn't always clear what you were supposed to do. Nonetheless, mistakes on ballots can lead to them being rejected. And then finally, and this is an entirely other talk that I can give and I have been giving, there are concerns about misinformation and disinformation after election day and on election night over vote counting. We are going to see a different pattern of vote counting, the election returns this year than we've seen in the past. I've written about how I don't think that's going to be as dramatically different as in the past. Nonetheless, it will be different. As the election results seesaw and look to favor one party or the other, that's going to give trolls and other people who just want to cause mischief to suggest that there's fraud and someone stealing an election somewhere, and that's something for us to worry about after the election. So I will stop my remarks right there. And again, thank you very much for the invitation. The league is really important in making sure that the types of reforms and changes that had to be made in Massachusetts actually get made, and in many cases working with local officials to make sure that poll workers and facilities and others are taken care of. So I know many people in this room have been responsible for any good that has come in Massachusetts. There are challenges around the country. I can tell you about the states I am worried about. Nonetheless, I do like to end these talks by saying, we've come a long way, and it's going to be a rocky ride, but I think it's going to be a credible election. So thank you for your time. And if we have time for questions, I would be more than happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Professor Stewart. That was fascinating. And so people, attendees, we did record this and we'll make it available. But I want to make sure if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. And I have a question, actually. I know social media amplifies everything, and not always in a good way. But Professor Stewart, should we be worried about voter intimidation tactics?
Yes, I think we should of numerous sorts. You mentioned social media, and there are reports that there is an increased amount of the type of misinformation right now in social media concerning how and where to vote. And the social media platforms are working hard to take those down. There's much more attention to it this time around. My sense in watching this is in some ways it's sort of whack-a-mole, that the people doing misinformation in this realm are actually faster than the takedown artists. So I mean, I'm worried. I'm really worried about that. I'm also just worried about kind of suppression of the vote or attempts to discourage people from voting. Just generally through social media in the division of the country over voting. We know that there are foreign elements and some domestic elements trying to divide Americans and to try to work on our distrust of government to get us to think that it's that voting is not worth our while and worth our time. Now, one of the things I'm noting from public opinion work is that I don't think that those efforts are actually being successful. the American electorate actually continues to report that they are very excited about the election. They've at record numbers. And so I think that the excitement of Americans is going to overcome a lot of this, and the work of a lot of people is going to overcome some of these problems. But we do need to be concerned. Absolutely.
Thank you. The question here, this is interesting. Do you think turnout for this election will be dramatically different than previous presidential elections?
Yeah, I think I'm banking, and a number of other people who've looked at this even more closely than I have are banking on historic levels, not only just numerical, but also in percentages. You know, the election of 2018 had a turnout level nationwide on a percentage basis that is the highest in a midterm year since the election of 1918. And if we get only half of the turnout boost in this election compared to 2016 of that election, it's kind of a convoluted way of saying it, we would see turnout level that America hasn't seen since the election of 1900. So we are looking at historic levels of turnout around the country. Not surprisingly, we're going to be seeing probably the highest levels in so-called battleground states, where a lot of the attention is. But but this is something else we saw in 1918, and I'm sorry, in 2018, and that we're seeing, continuing to 2020. We saw patterns of turnout in 2018 that, in a sense, that 2018 looked like a general election. I'll just put it that way. For instance, usually in midterms, we don't see young people voting. I mean, that's the part of the electorate actually that drops out in midterms, are young people, say 30 and younger. We didn't see that in 2018. Young people turned out to vote in 2018. If young people were going to turn out and vote in 2018, they're certainly going to turn out and vote in 2020. So, anyway, the polls, voters are expressing great interest, higher levels of interest than we've ever polled before. But secondly, everything we've seen in the elections since the election of Donald Trump is pointing toward pockets of the electorate that are hard to mobilize, are reluctant to mobilize, in fact, mobilizing in this election.
Do you have, I just lost it. Do you have any concern that voting is starting too early? Lots of time to campaign, dropouts, time to have forums, things like that.
I mean, yes and no. So here's my take on this, and I mean there are concerns, I think legitimate ones, about a lot of early voting and the rest. Putting on my political science hat, here's why I'm not as concerned about that as some people. First of all, the people who are voting the earliest are the people who've already made up their mind, and there's not a whole lot that forums or even October surprises can do to change people's minds. I would point out in North Carolina, for instance, where there's right now this sexting scandal for the Democratic challenger to Tom Tillis. In any other year, that would have changed the polls. That would have changed the nature of the campaign. Nothing, burger. Polls haven't moved. People have decided in that race how they're going to vote. As we've seen, as President Trump came down with COVID, that didn't move the needle much at all either. So with respect to people in the general election, voting too early, the people who are choosing to vote early have made up their minds. And I think it's the nature of partisanship these days, for better or worse, that makes it less, there are just fewer people to be convinced. That having been said, people are still interested in politics, and the number of people, for instance, watching the presidential debate, the slugfest in Cleveland, historic numbers watching that, despite the fact that many people had already voted. And I suspect, and that people watching the vice presidential debates was high. People watching this coming presidential debate will likely be high as well. So at a national level, there continues to be great interest in politics, even when people have voted. And I think that's because that people are just interested in politics right now and interested in the elections. And that energy and interest will carry past the election. Now, having said that, notice that I've been talking about national elections. And certainly, I think we need to think about the consequence of early voting for local elections, where things aren't driven by politics and where voters really do need to learn oftentimes about the candidates and the issues because unfortunately people don't want to pay attention to local politics as much as they could. So that is one thing to be concerned about, and certainly we need to think about that moving forward. Likewise for primaries, where things happen really fast. It was pointed out at a talk I was at yesterday that in California, for instance, something like a third of all the votes cast for candidates in the California primary were cast for candidates who had already dropped out of the race. This may very well be an argument for ranked choice voting, for instance. So there may be some other things, but the earlier you start voting with primaries, the more likely it is that you'll be voting for people no longer in the race. Massachusetts, we have a very short early voting period for primaries, precisely to try to avoid this problem. So, so the final thing I'll just say is that I just keep reiterating that this is an emergency. And anything we do in 2020, I think we're going to learn from 2020 a lot. But I've also encouraged people really to focus on how this is an emergency, and that we need to think after 2020 what elements of this election we want to make permanent and what elements we just want to put in the file drawer for the next emergency. Because emergency planning is important in elections, and we've learned a lot about emergency planning in this election.
Great. And this will be our last question, I think, because I think this is going to be it's a many-faceted one. We've had several questions in the chat about delayed results. When do experts predict we'll know? Who do we expect to announce those results? And what will be the media firestorm that results?
Yeah. Well, I mean, not to pat myself on the back, but I am one of those experts, and I've written about that. And we actually have I have something coming out in Slate probably Tuesday about this as well. And by the way, not necessarily for widespread attribution, but I'm a member of the CBS decision desk, so I'm seeing some of that from the inside as well. So what are we going to see? So here's the quick version of why I think things will be under more control on election night. There was an argument. There was an article about a month or two ago touting something called the red mirage. And here's the red mirage scenario. The red mirage suggests that, well, all the Trump, here's the cartoon version of it. All the Trump voters are going to vote on election day. All the Biden voters are going to vote early. So because, again, this is the cartoon version, but this is how it goes. Because all the election day votes will be counted first and reported, there will be, looks like, a landslide victory for Donald Trump on election day. But that's a mirage, as the late ballots then are counted. And as the days go by, Trump's mirage victory becomes a Biden comfortable victory. And in the process, we can all imagine what Donald Trump is going to be doing as his victory slips away. I think that's an irresponsible characterization. And then the Red Mirage article is evidence, as I've written. It was written by people who have no idea about how election administration works. Thing number one is election day votes are not counted first, or at least in most places. Florida, for instance. Florida has already started counting their mail ballots. Texas and North Carolina and Georgia, as they're getting their early voting in person, they're tallying those votes. They're not reporting them, but they're scanning them and they're reporting them, such that on election night, you literally push a button and you know what happened. So Florida has a law, for instance, that requires counties to report their mail ballot and in-person voting 30 minutes after their polls close. So their polls close at 7. By 7:30, we will have 2/3 of the election returns from Florida already reported. By 11 o'clock, Florida, 95% of Florida will be reported. Okay, so this gets to what I think election night is going to look like. And again, I mean, there's no certainty here, but if we take the polls as they are currently given, which has, you know, Biden up nationally, has him up in all the battleground states that matter, and think about Florida, that has him up by about 3 points in Florida. If at 10 o'clock on election night, let's just say kind of a more traditional, if what I just said is true, then it's likely, and this is based on no inside knowledge that I have, then by 10 o'clock or so, the networks could very well call Florida for Biden. If they call Florida for Biden, the election's over, and we'll know this, even if there are still outstanding ballots in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, right? Because if Florida goes to Biden, that means in Florida, sentiments have shifted toward the Democratic candidate away from Trump around 8 percentage points. And that suggests in nationwide, there's going to be an 8 percentage point shift toward Biden compared to Clinton. And so that states like Pennsylvania, you know, the states I just mentioned, are likely going to go to Biden. Given what I know about the vote counting in various states, I think we'll be surprisingly fast in Wisconsin and North Carolina. That there will be states like Texas, Tennessee, Kentucky that are not necessarily battleground, but nonetheless will be counting quickly. And we will see how votes shift in those states. So that what I've been saying is I think that by midnight on election night, the path to 270 will be very, very clear. And that there will be a narrative emerging about what the electorate said in this election. Now, to be very clear, the election will not be called officially until the canvass of all the votes occurs. And in many states, that's going to take several weeks. But the networks will be projecting winners as they have traditionally. They will be projecting based on the election returns. They do not project based on the exit polls. They will be projecting based on what they know about the votes that have been reported, the votes that are yet to be reported, and essentially the question is always in a decision desk, can the trailing candidate overtake the leader given the outstanding votes and where they are? And, you know, all of the networks have models. They've been rehearsing them. We know what election patterns look like. They will be projecting as they have in the past. And so if, according to this scenario, again, we could very well, at least as a nation, kind of know what the story is by midnight. And I think by the time the sun rises on Wednesday, all of the networks could very well have projected victors in enough states to get one of the candidates, presumably Biden, over 270. In that case, and so this is where then you have to think about what the Trump campaign is going to be doing, and actually what national Republicans are going to be doing. If this is the scenario that plays out, then it might be, if there is a sinking ship, then going after presidential votes in states that are still counting, like Pennsylvania, may be a waste of time and effort. And greater effort may be turned to challenging and scrutinizing election results in North Carolina, Arizona, other states, South Carolina, Montana. You can go down the list. So many states that are going to determine the outcome of the Senate, and that may be seen as being the bigger electoral prize to be focused on at that point. So that's what I think the more likely scenario is a real fight for the Senate rather than for the presidency. But there is a non-zero probability of, you know, kind of a more off the rails election night. If Florida is close on election night, then we're going to have to wait longer. If Florida is close in election night, it means it's going to be closer in these other states than we've been anticipating, than the polls have been saying. So we'll have to wait longer for Wisconsin, North Carolina, Michigan to report their ballots, and the role of Pennsylvania will become even more important. This will be the last thing I say. I know we're way over time, but and let me tell you why I'm worried about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a type of election administration that they have actually. New York and Missouri, several other states where there's a Democrat and Republican commissioner that like runs the county. But not only in Pennsylvania is there a DNR running the county election apparatus. That's also true in the precincts as well. And this is so by the Constitution of Pennsylvania. So these are constitutional officers, the precinct, what we would call a warden. There's a Democratic and Republican warden in every precinct. They are elected by the Democrats and the Republicans in those precincts. And they get their jobs by virtue of the Pennsylvania Constitution. And so they just can't be like tossed out for mal or misfeasance easily. And I've been told that there is a tradition in Pennsylvania of frivolous challenges to mail ballots. And so the thing I worry about in Pennsylvania is frivolous challenging of mail ballots that could draw out the counting of those mail ballots longer than it might have been drawn out otherwise. And so that's the basis of my concern about Pennsylvania. It's not because they have a lot of mail ballots, and it's not because they're going to start counting on election day. It doesn't take long to count ballots when you're scanning them. It's more this challenge process that's highly political and is the bane of the reformers in Pennsylvania. If you talk to the Committee on 70 in Philadelphia or the League in Pennsylvania, this is what makes one of the things that makes elections in Pennsylvania so crazy making. So there you go. Thanks. And let's hope these off the rails scenarios don't happen after the election. But in all of this, even in the best case scenario, we know that President Trump is going to be tweeting. We know that his supporters will be listening. We know, again, if the polls hold true, that there will be some of his, it has to be the case that some of his supporters will take to the streets and may in fact, act to try to protect the election for him. And so, Homeland Security knows about this, law enforcement around the country knows about this. And so we should prepare to hear stories of civil unrest around the country over the election outcome either way. And I hate to end on such a bummer of a note because I think election administration is actually pulling it together. And so this will be the last thing I say. I've been encouraging people. There's something coming out in Cognoscenti and WBUR that I wrote this next week. I'm encouraging people to follow what the election officials are doing. Follow the process. That's what matters, not what the tweets of a losing candidate have to say. So with that, I'll shut up. And thank you for